Alright, what's poppin', people? Finally, we have been able to get this damned viability rankings thread updated for the metagame that started about, what, 5 weeks ago? Obviously, we'd like to get it out sooner, but when you've got a constantly shifting metagame as a result of council votes to get rid of the brokens in the tier, and then you end up running into the next tier shift, things get a little bit dicey. However, we finally got it up and running. I'm gonna at least give a brief rundown of what's high up on the VR and maybe why it's there. While I would love to talk about Pokemon that have fallen off, particularly ones that fell off really hard, I think most of that could just be explained away by power creep went up. You know, what good does it really do to talk about why Basculin is C rank now? What good does it really do to tell you all about why, say, Sylvally Dark is bad now? I feel like these are things that we've discussed ad nauseum at this point, and if you want a detailed response, I can give it to you in the comments or something. But it's not really something I feel like discussing right now, and so we're not going to. So, as we disregard these guys here, as we look at our S rank, we have two buddies down here. We've got a Scavalier and Gallade. The Scavalier obviously coming to us with the October tier shifts, and Glade being one of our unbans that we did at the beginning of September. And I think people probably agree with both of these as S rankers, I would imagine. A Scavalier has asserted itself as one of the de facto steel types you look at for steel type defensive purposes when you're building a team. It's a great Draco Meteor switch in, a great Doraledon switch in general. I don't think it threatens a 3-hit KO with any of its moves unless it has injury hazards help. And the Scavalier also has a fairly diverse amount of sets that it can run. You've got Choice Band, you've got Offensive Swords Dance, you've got Especially Defensive, which can, run several moves. I've seen some people talk about Rest Talk, Assault Vest. It has a lot of options for what it can do. And it's also just got really high stats. And I think that's something important to consider sometimes when looking at why Pokemon could be good. It really can just be something as simple as stats. Consider Snorlax when it was here. It was basically stat checking everything because it was just so much stronger and bulkier than everything around it. And while a Scavalier is not to that extent, it still kind of does stat check things, right? I mean, compare a Scavalier's stats to, say, that of something lower on the VR, something I won't talk about, I guess. Like Abomasnow, right? A Scavalier's highest stat, I think, is 130, whereas Abomasnow's is 92. And a Scavalier has multiple stats that are at least 100. So it's comparing it to some of the things that aren't perceived as good, you can start to see why it is such a dominant Pokemon. And of course it also has, great coverage, it's got knockoff, it doesn't even get chipped by hail if you run Overcoat, so that helps it in the Aurora Veil team matchup. It's just overall really helpful. And in Gallade, I think I've talked about it before, but there are a lot of things that Gallade loves. It loves how defensively the checks people use to fighting types are his resistances even to fighting don't beat Gallade. You've got Weezing and Mudsdale. Gallade can muscle through both of those. And it's a much better shot in the long run against those than compared to something like, say, Cofagrigus, which is still pretty common, but not as common, I would say, as those two. Gallade loves, in addition to that, how it synergizes super well with U-turn support from Ribombee and Whimsicott. Given what those Pokemon draw in, it typically can decimate. Obviously, a Scavalier being introduced into tier does hurt that synergy a little bit, but I don't think it's anything that really stops Gallade still from doing what it wants to do, especially because you've got Trick. You can always make headway, even if you just need to sack Gallade against a team or something, because you could run into a bad matchup with Gallade. But it'll always be able to contribute something because of the utility that it brings. Whether it be through revenge killing, knockoff spamming, crippling something with Trick, it will do something every game. And of course, the set, that people don't see as much anymore, Life Orb, still's around, and it is something you just have to prep for because if you don't have a way to revenge kill a Glade and it swords dances up, it's kind of dire. So now we're going to look at our A+ rank. I think Jellicent might surprise some people, but it didn't surprise me. Well, it surprised me a little bit, mostly because I didn't expect it to get the votes, but I voted it for A+. I think Jellicent's amazing. I agree with it being a top 5 Pokemon in a tier. It's just so bulky. Like, unreasonably bulky. Like, you look at Jellicent and you're like, ah yes, I'm going to Volt Switch out. And then for some reason Jellicent just doesn't take damage. It's like, ah yes, thank you for doing a crisp 35%. I will now Toxic your Wishy-Washy that comes in. It's just a really annoying Pokemon to deal with. And while, for the most part, people don't really go beyond the standard defensive sets, Taunt plus Toxic plus Recovery plus Scald, man, that's just not fun. And you've got, like, Strength Sap as well that can get thrown in there. It's just overall a really obnoxious Pokemon to deal with. Its physical bulk is a little bit poor. Even, like, when you invest into it, stuff like Mudsdale can still pressure you pretty effectively. And despite your great special bulk, you're still not, you know, taking Dracos from Doraledon particularly well. But, like, these weaker special attacks, or even just attacks from, like, weaker Pokemon, say, like, a Boots or Bombi, don't really phase Jellicent at all. And they allow it to have a presence pretty much throughout the match, where it's just bothering your team with status, with taunt, with just recovering up versus Pokemon that can't deal with it, is really good. And then we got Mudsdale. Now, I wouldn't have even been surprised if Mudsdale had gotten into S rank. I ended up voting A+ just because I felt like CB isn't as consistent as I would like it to be. And so it does really end up just being this, like, wall. And while it's really good at being a wall, it's often relied on to check a lot of stuff, and so it can end up getting just pressured by teams over the course of a match from it trying to check so many Pokemon. But despite that, it's a really good answer to stuff like, say, Gallade. It can sort of check a Scavalier. You know, it can pivot into Ninjask as it needs to. It's easily the most reliable rocker in a tier where you could argue against the, like, necessity to even put Stealth Rock on a team. I think Mudsdale, being as good as it is, always, like, makes Stealth Rock relevant. And again, when we talk about, like, Mudsdale, we also have to reference its diversity as well. I did, you know, just talk negatively about it, but CB is still a really good breaker. You've got, like, defensive rocks, you've got offensive rocks, there's even, like, sub-toxic. Runs around occasionally. The horse is annoying, but it can do a lot of stuff really well. And we got little old Rabombi. It's a Pokemon that people had been trying to get banned a lot last month. Never was able to get the threshold. I think we had it come close at least once. But it has settled into a pretty nice spot in the tiers, like the premier pivot. Unless you, like, beyond Ninjask, right? Rabombi 2 is just a super fast Pokemon that, because you just give it heavy duty boots, it pivots for free with U-turn, doesn't care about hazards at all. And it has a lot of good synergy with stuff like Doraledon, like Gallade, like a Scavalier, because it brings in Pokemon that a lot of our common wall breakers can just feast on. You know, think about like Garbodors, Weezings, Scavalier in the cases of some of these Pokemon, they can break it. I also really like the core of like Rabombi and Magneton. I think it's pretty fun. I don't think Magneton's the most consistent Pokemon, but I do think trapping is at least somewhat relevant. And of course Rabombi, this again is like an a la Ninjask thing. Rabombi has that just scary late game where you always have to be wary of it boosting Quiver Dance and just getting into a position where it can sweep your entire team if you let like your checks to go down to it. There was a time where I think you really had to run multiple switch-ins to Moonblast, because if you didn't, you were going to get mowed down by Specs Rabombi. Or even just Quiver Dance Rabombi, because you didn't want to have only one check. You wanted to have that, like, fallback. Because there isn't much that beats Rabombi when it boosts, because so little... Nothing outspeeds it, really. You have to get a Ninjask and then win a 50-50 on protect... On, like, protecting on an attack, or protecting as it just sits another Quiver up. Specs has fallen off, I would say, I think mostly because people just love the no drawback pivoting. But I still think it's a pretty decent breaker. You know, you've got U-turn, you've got Trick, so you're never really, like, dead in the water, even against something like an Escavalier, which walls you forever. I think Escavalier's dropping is a big reason I wouldn't put Rabombi in S anymore. I just think it holds it back enough now. We've got enough Pokemon, like Rise of Rapidash as well. So I don't think the B is as big of a threat as it used to be. It really is getting restricted to being just a U-turn spamming bot. And while that doesn't really like negate how good of a Pokemon it is, I do think it holds it down at least a little bit compared to Escavalier and Gallade. And now as we look at the A rank, we start off with Kofagrigus, who literally did not step below S rank once we had our first VR update, like way back in April. I believe Kofa started off as an A+ Pokemon, and then we like immediately pushed it into S after that first update, and it sat in S forever. And I think there were probably points where you could have justified dropping it out. We never did. But now we have, and I think a big part of that is because of how many special wall breakers there are compared to then, and the meta is like following that first month of the tier. You've got like the occasional offensive Jellicent, you've got Rabombi, you've got Doraledon, you've got like Specs Rhodum, you've got Ninetales, you've got Whimsicott. There's just a lot. There's a lot for Kofa to try to like deal with. And in general, I do think ghost types are a little bit worse off. I say that as you see like 4 up here. But I do think like ghost as a typing isn't as dominant as it once was, despite dark types even falling off. It's hard to give a reason why, really, because there's not much reason for them to be worse off. I think a big part of it could just be that there's not as much that they're relied on to like soft check anymore. Particularly with Toxicroak going. Because most ghost types don't want to deal with Gallade as is. You know, it's like Rhodum's gonna get popped by knockoff if it switches into that, and it doesn't want to take a Zen Headbutt. Jellicent doesn't really want to get tricked. Kofa doesn't really want to get tricked. And Silvally Ghost wants to preserve HP, especially if it's a substitute variant. And so, I don't know. They just don't do as much defensive as they used to. The Coffin, though, is still super like annoying to deal with, whether it's Iron Defense sets boosting up, whether it's just general utility. It's still a really strong Pokemon, and it does still soft check, or you just check a lot of physical attackers. Like, it does, you know, it is a good Gallade answer. You handle Life Orb sets super well if you're Colberry. And so long as you don't switch into a trick, you're fine versus Scarf. You do check like something like Ninjask as well. Rapidash, especially if you're like Rest, you handle that. Girder, Silvally Dragon if it's physical. It's overall just a really good Pokemon still. But I do think that it struggles to just check the entire tier like it used to. You know, Kofa used to be able to just have it blanket check at least like half the Pokemon that existed. I don't really think that's the case anymore. Then we get to this piece of dog. Oof. Hate you. We get to Doraledon. And I still don't really know how I feel about this Pokemon, but I did vote for it to be an A. I think Specs is scary. And not necessarily in that it's like some super, like, you know, splashable breaker, as much as it is just Draco is super free to click. Because the immunities don't want to switch into Flash Cannon. And I also think Doraledon has a lot of application just across builds, so long as you're using the different sets and not always trying to default to Specs. Because you've got Scarf, and it can also just be like Scarf Rocks. You've got Iron Defense, you've got Lead Rocks for like HO-oriented builds. It has a fair few amount of options, which I think is nice. I think my issue with Doraledon that I used to have was I was trying so hard to force Specs on the builds, but I don't think that's what you want to do a lot of the time. I think Specs is a lot more limited in what you can like fit it with. Whereas the other sets just let you open up more. Like with your designated slots, you don't have to be like, okay, well this is my breaker. And you get a little bit sad about how that means you're pretty much forced into like Rabombi Ninjask-like teams, which aren't bad. It's just, hey man, sometimes you gotta get a little bit of diversity in your builder. And I do think Doraledon still does suffer from things I've always harped on it for suffering with. Particularly how it's just not a Steel type or a Dragon type when you look at what it does defensively. But It is strong. It has late game potential if you're a setup set. I really like how Iron Defense sets also just beat a lot of the steel types that try to check it. In particular, I've been messing around with this especially defensive Iron Defense set, like just full on bulky. And hey man, you check stuff like Cramorant now. You know, checking Cramorant, you know, you can switch into Cramorant and it's got annoying coverage. You can switch into Rhodum better, both Rhodum A right here and Rhodum Fan. You can even switch into like Weezing. You don't want to get burned by like the really defensive variants, obviously, but cool Pokemon. There's not much I could really even say about Ninjask, man. It's just, look, I put my biases aside and I acknowledge that Ninjask is the premier pivot because you can't stop it from U-turning. Is that what you wanted me to say? It's a good pivot. Not better than Rabombi, yet. Although you could probably argue it is, but I won't. But it is a premier pivot because it is very fast and has speed boost and can clean teams late game. It also appreciates how the Escavalier is now the premier steel type, because that is not resistant to flying, whereas things like Gallarfisk are. In particular, even here, it really likes how Mudsdale is also the premier ground type, because it means there's less Gallarfisk. That is all I will say on Ninjask. And we get to Rhodum. Rhodum was like, what, A+ when we froze the VR? That was A. I think we saw a lot of people voting it for A+. I think Rhodum actually had a pretty bad fall off throughout much of September due to Sneasel being here. But as people started to experiment more with it, you know, whether it be spec sets, whether it be, you know, Hex, whether it be sub-Nasty Plot, I think Rhodum has seen a strong resurgence, and additionally, the banning of Sneasel helped a lot. I still kept it in A. Actually, I might have even only voted for A-. But I am still a little bit lukewarm on Rhodum. I want to see it truly like hit that resurgence fully before I support it just going back up to A+. Hell, even Nasty Plot Rest with Chesto is really cool, because it means you're, you know, more consistent answer to something like, say, non-Shadow Ball Weezing to Mudsdale. I think I think Rhodum has just a lot of interesting little moveset changes you can do right now, which I like. And we get Weezing. It just does the same shit it always does. It's a good Mudsdale answer because you get to switch in versus it for free as long as it doesn't like smack you down. And you get to set T-Spikes. And we're seeing also a lot more, I don't know if it's necessarily offensive Weezing, but we're seeing like 3 attacks plus T-Spikes a lot, wherein you go Sludge Bomb, Fire Move, Shadow Ball. Pretty much looking to prevent anything that would want to take advantage of you, such as, say, Jellicent or Escavalier, from ever really doing so. You know, with like Fire Blast, you do not need too much special attack to OHKO an Escavalier, which is cool. Now, most Escavalier are running bulk, obviously, but hey. Fire Blast is very good at dissuading switch-ins from Escavalier. And T-Spikes I think is just always really good support, especially because Mudsdale generally isn't running boots. Same with Kofa, a lot of time they prefer lefties or Colbur respectively. Which will usually mean you can end up getting some run at least out of your hazard, which can be hard to do in Inu because of how prevalent boots are as an item. And also, it's just really nice to have a fucking ground immunity on teams, dude. I feel like Inu this gen has just been defined by lack of good ground immunities. It's been what, like Rhodum, and in like its forms when Rhodum A wasn't here, and like what else really? Cramorant. There just haven't been many. I mean, obviously you also had Ninjask, but I don't want to call this a good ground immunity because it just dies to the coverage that they run because of its poor bulk. So I don't know. And we get to the A-. Clefairy, I honestly really don't know how I feel about Clef right now. I think I had a vote for it to be in B+. I think we were overall pretty, like, people had votes ranging from A to B+. At the end of the day, it's still, you know, knocks. It's still wish passes. It's still a good blanket check to special attackers. It can still go physically defensive and, you know, check some miscellaneous things. It can set rocks. It does a lot. Good on stall builds as well, which is cool. There's really not much else I can say. Clefairy does what it has always done. and I don't think there are really too many trends that hurt it. It doesn't like that we have more steel types now, but as I said, knockoff. None of them really have good recovery. So if it's something like a Viability steel that keeps switching into you, I mean, it's getting chipped. And in Ferroseed, it didn't move at all. It's pretty much just still setting hazards, knocking, leeching. And I also think that it's cool because spike support is appreciated by a lot of the super good pivots at the moment. And it's also probably the best, or not the best, but it's one of the better water type move switch-ins. Because you don't care about Jellicent going for Toxic. You know, Wishy-Washy can't poison you either. I do think there's a strong case to be made that Ferroseed is the best grass type in the tier over Whimsicott, which is very, very depressing. Because again, I feel like Ferroseed is just such a weird Pokemon and that it doesn't necessarily do anything particularly well, but it has a lot of useful traits. Like, even the, Fairy Resistance is super big. You know, Ferroseed is not going to be broken by a Whimsicott or a Ribombee very easily. It does suck that Leech is your only recovery, but eh. And Garbodor, honestly, Garbodor could be B+ as well. I think I voted it for A-. But it's still spending spikes. It doesn't love how prevalent, though, that, like, Wheezing is. Same with Doraledon and Escavalier. But at least with Jellicent and Mudsdale, and even, like, Rhodum, you can always get that Toxic off. Ninjask isn't, like, if you're physically defensive, at least, Ninjask isn't OHKOing you with a boosted attack. You check the fairies if you're specially defensive. There's at least there's some room for adaptation, though. I do think Garbodor is probably trending downward more than upward. So, you know, look out for Garbodor maybe dropping in the future. Then we got the God Tanker himself, Miltank. It really likes the fact that it walls these two things forever. It doesn't like Toxic Rapidash existing. But even in the wake of Sneasel leaving, it's still really good because it pretty much just invalidates Ninetales as a Pokemon. And if you do run into, like, the random, you know, offensive Specs Vanillix, well, you're walling that too. I even think there's the option of dropping rocks on it and going Heal Bell plus Toxic, which is just very, very annoying. And because Miltank has recovery, you don't even have to go lefties, you can just go boots. Which is really cool if you run into spike stacking teams. And I guess I could cover Ninetales and Rapidash in one point. They're both good because they're the only good fire types. They both offer some defensive utility in checking the fairies. Obviously, Ninetales can't go for those bulkier sets because it doesn't have recovery. Rapidash does. And Rapidash is also good at drawing infos like Mudsdale, Jellicent, Rhydon, and getting off Toxics, whereas Ninetales just beats a lot of those Pokemon outright by boosting and then energy balling them. I would even say Ninetales is pretty much solely responsible for Rhydon being super bad. Mudsdale contributes to that too, but Ninetales is a huge reason because it just means that Rhydon doesn't check the prevalent fire type in the tier. And I mean, you do check Rapidash, but you're usually just going out and getting Toxic'd and then throughout the rest of the battle slowly getting whittled down by high horsepower. It's sort of like how the Incineroar sequences played out in Gen 7 in you, where you got knocked and then just slowly earthquaked or U-turned on. You didn't really win. You just prevented them from using their fire move. Well, it can't even do that with Ninetales, because Ninetales just outspeeds it always. And threatens the OHKO always. It's sad. Then we got a little Sandslash Alola in A- here. I like him because he's very versatile. Because it can set Stealth Rock spikes or Rapid Spin, there's just a lot of ways to fit it on the teams. And of course, it being a very good Fairy Resist is helpful too. You got knockoff utility. The only real problem I have with Alolan Sandslash beyond like no viable recovery is that you don't check Doraledon very well because you're quad weak to Body Press. But I think otherwise it's a pretty good Pokemon right now. And the versatility and amount of utility it offers to teams makes it so it lends itself to a wide variety of potential archetypes. You can even see it on, you know, those Hail cores where you'll have Aurora Veil Vanillix to support offensive SD Alola Sandslash, which I like. And here's Silvally Ghost, who has had a huge resurgence and is finally living up to the hype I think that it came into the generation with. Or not the generation with, but the tier with when it originally dropped. Dark types are dead. And so Silvally Ghost's multi-attack is super easy to spam. The only normal type what we have up here is Miltank. And you get to go for the nice little substitute unless it's, you know, NASCAR Miltank. But if it's not, you get to get the sub up versus it before it can toxic you, and you just freely sword stance up, and you win game. The meta does not have a lot of ghost type checks either. You know, you see Persian all the way down in B. And presuming that there's no big resurgence in Alolan Persian usage, I think the Alolan, not Alolan, I think the Silvally Ghost is going to keep trending upward, and it could probably end up somewhere around here. It is very good. And we get Whimsicott. Whimsicott's kind of unfortunate. It has to directly compete with Ribombee. It has to deal with all the steel types that exist because of Ribombee. It has to deal with the fire types existing because of Ribombee in part. It has to deal with the Scavalier being a Pokemon and quad resisting its grass stab. Yeah. It's still a good pivot. But like, its opportunities to clean with its like decently powerful choice specs boosted attacks aren't as common as they have been in like say Sun and Moon and you. Because there's just so much stuff that exists and just says no, you don't get to do this. Like at least last gen the prevalent fire type didn't resist Moonblast, so you could chip away at it a lot more effectively. You're not breaking Rapidash with Whimsicott. You're just not. And then we round out our A ranks with Wishy-Washy down here. It surprisingly has seen the drop of Jellicent and Gastrodon and said, okay, I'm still relevant. A big part of it being that specialty defensive sets are just super nice because they check Ninetales really, really effectively. In addition to just checking a wide variety of Pokemon via this Pokemon's naturally high stats. I mean, keep in mind, when it's in school form, sure, its HP is like base 40 or 45, but most other stats are like base 130. It is very strong, even with little amounts of investment. Your Scalds, your Liquidations, or whichever, you know, stab move you've got, they're gonna hurt. You can very easily spread Toxics around versus Jellicents, Whimsicotts, anything else that wants to switch into Wishy-Washy, really. It's just generally annoying Pokemon, man. I hate it. And now we're going to do a little bit of a speed run as we just go through the rest of the things, because I guess it would be nice to talk about at least what they're doing. So Call Witzer got choice specs. Girder, it's still doing bulk up things. Magneton I really like for Choice Scarf because it lets you outspeed the fairy types. I don't think you need the damage output of specs personally. Rhodum Fan we've actually seen kind of hold on to a lot of viability. Helps that you are bulky, because you actually check Gallade, and you're also faster than it. I like Ping Split variants in particular because they check Ninjask a little bit better. We got Silvally Dragon here. I've seen a lot more special variants of it, like Work Up with Draco and Flamethrower, because those can like lure into steel types and then beat them. Silvally Steel's just kind of fallen off a little bit more and more because people are realizing it still has the same issues as the last gen, where it just doesn't have good recovery. It's still a fine enough pivot and defogger, but that's about it. It also has competition with a Scavalier now as a steel type, which is not fun. Gallerfisk, we've talked about a bit why it's fallen off, but a lot of it's Mudsdale and a Scavalier doing what it wants to do. It's still a passable rocker, and it offers a lot of roll compression though. Vanillix, it sets Aurora Veil and does nothing else. It tries to use Blizzard and usually just doesn't make much progress with it because they're very common Pokemon that take Blizzards and don't care. Kingler, it pretty much is exclusively seen on HO from my experience with like Dual Dance. Lantern, it's pretty much just outdone by Wishy-Washy and Jellicent. I could see cases though in which you need to compress maybe like Cleric support and the electric immunity into your water type slot. Maybe then you need to use Lantern, but otherwise it's usually just better to use one of the more viable options. Alola Persian, it still does what it did last month, just to lower, or not last month, like 2 months ago, just to much lower rates because of the prevalence of fairy types. Piloswine, pretty much just outdone by Mudsdale as an offensive rocker, but it can offer some priority and a better check to fire types because of thick fat. Rhydon is really hard outclassed by Mudsdale. I do think setup sets are pretty cool though, but otherwise I think you're just better off using Mudsdale every time. Togedemaru had a vote for A- rank, and I was very surprised to see that because I think Togedemaru is very bad right now. I think the best sets are like Wish, Wish Spiky Shield with Iron Head U-turn, or like Toxic if you need to fit it in there. But overall, I feel like Togedemaru doesn't do a whole lot that other steel types can't do a little bit better. There are obviously times where you would want to use it, primarily for the Wish support. It's just such an uninspiring Pokemon, and it also doesn't help that it hard loses to Rhodum. Particularly when I'm saying Rhodum, I think of like Subplot. Asalgor, I've seen mostly like boots sets with spikes, so like fast, not a fast pivot because it's going like boots 3 attacks, but kind of like that Ash Greninja role where it's just a very fast Pokemon that forces a lot of switches because it is kind of scary to switch into because its coverage is decent. Aromadis, I don't know why it's in B-, it's bad, but it does check a few things. Like, it can check Gallade, which is cool, and has Wish. Cramorant, I saw people saying that it could go even higher than B-, but Cramorant is a pretty cool Pokemon at this juncture. It's kind of annoying to switch into. It's got deceptively good special bulk, so it does check a fair few things, especially like Ninetales being the prevalent one. And obviously it's a ground immune, so it's automatically good. Eldegoss, it's doo-doo, but it spins and can be a cleric. Frostmoth, it's very doo-doo, but it can Quiver Dance on Hyper Offense. Galvantula, I haven't seen much of, but like, I kind of think it would be like Zeraora in the sense of it's an electric type pivot. And it can also go Specs. And Spec sets are actually kind of annoying because that Thunder hurts, and Galvantula's coverage is really nice. The only issue for Galvantula that I really see and why I'm kind of low on it in general is that you're having to compete directly with Ninjask and Rabombi as that, bug type pivot, which is dire. Gastrodon, it could go higher. It just doesn't check as much as I'd like it to, personally. I think sticky hold sets might hold some merit, because then you can switch in a knockoff from shit like Kingler. And as long as it doesn't Swords Dance up, I think you beat it, so you at least beat Scarf Kingler. Gorga Small had a big fall off in viability, but I do think with the fall off of Alolan version, despite it being higher in the ranking, I do think like Life Orb sets are pretty okay. They also have Fire Blast, so you can lure in and beat up on a Scavalier, which is cool. Kanga's just not as good of a breaker anymore because there's more stuff that checks it, really. You've got, in addition to Kofa and Weezing, you've got like Mudsdale, a Scavalier. Valley Dark, maybe it gets better now that Sneasel's gone, but I think the big issue for it is it doesn't love Mudsdale being around, even though you can beat it over time. And it hates the prevalence of fairy types. Everyone knows why Appleton's here, man. Optimal check to fire types. I don't really know what Frostlass does, frankly, but I imagine it's still a decent breaker, and probably a good spiker. Poliwrath, it does a whole bunch of stuff. Belly Drum, Choice Scarf, Bulk Up, Defensive. It just does all this stuff at a really, really poor rate. Quagsire is a stall Pokemon. Valley Poison is a very niche defogger that also absorbs Sea Spikes and still checks fairies, which is cool. And all these, oh god. So Abomasnow, right? The only niche it has over Vanillix really is that it has coverage for steel types. I was originally going to vote to rank it at C, but when a Scavalier dropped, I said no, I'm good. But we still had enough people thinking that it held enough viability to stay on here, so there's that. And it's similar to Alchemy, wherein it's pretty much here because it's a fairy type that beats steels. Basculin, we went over it earlier. Is it Cinchino? I don't know how to say it. Cinchino, we'll say. It's an okay enough breaker with like knock and U-turn, but beyond that, it does nothing. Flareon, its sole niche is that it's even more dedicated to checking stuff defensively than Rapidash. Liepard tries ever so desperately to fulfill the role of fast dark type with knockoff, and adds in pivoting, but to no avail. It is not a Sneasel. Quillfish nearly got unranked. I haven't seen a Quillfish in forever, and the few times that I have seen it, it's been really bad. It's still pretty much just trying to do that like intimidate spiking stuff, and disrupting teams like Taunt and Status. Sableye, again, we got like exclusively stall. Sandaconda's weird because it's no longer at all worth running for rocks, but I do think there is at least some merit to like Coil and Choice Scarf. Then there's Sock. I'm really not sure how to rank Sock because it's pretty much just a worse Gallade. The nice thing about Sock though is it is a little faster. So, read into that what you may. Savali Water, it's okay enough at defogging. It threatens the Stealth Rockers with super effective damage. If it's not Miltank, I'm thinking Mudsdale only in my head, really. Skuntank's just a lot worse now because it doesn't break teams as consistently with Mudsdale around. Thievul, so Thwacky's here, but I don't rank Thievul for this like synergy at all. I rank Thievul because of choice specs. I think specs is pretty okay. It is matchup fishy because you don't want to run into a Clefairy, but if you don't ever get Clefairy'd, you're winning so hard with Thievul. Stakeout Specs Dark Pulse is really good. And I don't know why Thwacky's here. I'm assuming it's terrain extending shenanigans. That's gonna be it. We finally have this updated, and I'm happy to see where it goes. Obviously, if you've got any thoughts on where things should be ranked, I mean, I'd say leave them in the comments of the video so I can just see and go, huh, that's interesting. But I feel like they'd probably go better in this thread. That's gonna be it for me, though. I'm happy to see where the tier goes. We get DLC 2 drops in 2 weeks because of the NFEs. You know, those will automatically be in you. Don't know if any will be viable, but maybe they will. Hope you guys enjoyed the rest of your, I don't know, morning, day, evening, night, afternoon, whatever the hell. I'll see you guys next time. Peace.